the ancient history of the Apache warriors. Sometime between the years 1000 and 1500, groups of hunters speaking a language called Athabascan began moving south from the subarctic regions of what is now Alaska and Western Canada. They were not a single people traveling together. They moved in waves over generations, following game, reading terrain, and pushing steadily toward the warmer lands of the South. By the time Spanish explorers first encountered them in the 1500s, they had been in the American Southwest long enough to know every water source, every canyon, every mountain pass across a territory that modern estimates place at more than 50 million acres, covering what is now southeastern Arizona, most of New Mexico, western Texas, and the northern Mexican states of Chihuahua and Sonora. They called themselves NDE, or Tinde, various dialects of the same word, all meaning the people. The Zuni people, who had already been in the Southwest for centuries before them, gave them a different name, Apache, meaning enemy. The Spanish transliterated it to Apache, and the name remained in use by everyone except the people it described. There was no single Apache nation. There were bands, the Chiricahua along the Arizona and New Mexico border, the Mescalero in New Mexico, the Guerrilla in the north, the Western Apache in Arizona, the Lipan in Texas, the Plains Apache in Oklahoma. Each band was politically independent, with no central government and no hereditary chiefs. Leadership was earned through demonstrated ability and could be challenged and lost. Every aspect of their culture was built around mobility, adaptability, and survival in terrain that killed unprepared outsiders. What does a people do when the most powerful military forces of 3 consecutive centuries arrive at the edges of their territory and decide they have no right to remain? And what does it mean that for 300 years, the answer was consistently the same? They fight, and they are extraordinarily difficult to stop. Spain builds forts, but cannot stop the raids. In the 1650s, something shifted in the relationship between the Apache bands and the Spanish settlers who had been establishing missions, presidios, and farming communities across what is now New Mexico and the northern Mexican states. The first contacts in the 1500s had been largely peaceful. The Spanish explorer Coronado recorded Querechos living west of the Rio Grande in the 1580s as buffalo hunters with trade relationships with the Pueblo people. What changed the dynamic was not a single event, but an accumulating pattern. Spanish slave raids against Apache communities, the displacement of Apache hunting grounds by Spanish livestock, and the growing pressure of missions that demanded labor and conversion. By the 1650s, the Apache were raiding Spanish settlements systematically. From the city of Santa Fe and the town of El Paso, the Spanish fought back for 2 decades with only partial success. The 1760s and 1770s brought the most violent period. In just the states of Chihuahua and Coahuila, between 1771 and 1776, 1,674 Spanish citizens were killed, and 154 were captured. More than 100 ranches were abandoned. More than 68,000 animals were stolen. The Spanish response in the 1770s was to reorganize their entire northern defense, a chain of 18 forts, each approximately 100 miles apart, running across Sonora, Chihuahua, Texas, New Mexico, and what is now Arizona. The presidio at Llanos, Chihuahua, became the most important. The fort at Tucson, Presidio San Agustin del Tucson, became the first permanent Spanish settlement in Arizona. The largest forts garrisoned up to 144 soldiers. 1,000 soldiers in total, supported by local militia and Native American allies. The punitive campaigns killed many Apache. They did not stop the raids. The Apache knew the terrain far better than anyone pursuing them, traveled faster on foot than cavalry traveled on horseback through canyon country, and simply dissolved into the landscape when pursued. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support, and let's continue. A giant chief unites all the Apache bands. Around 1793, in what is now southwestern New Mexico, a child was born to the Badon Cohe band of the Apache who would grow to stand 6 feet and 6 inches tall, a remarkable height in any era, and extraordinary among a people whose men typically stood considerably shorter. His Apache name was Dasoda Haye, meaning he just sits there. The Mexicans who came to fear and respect him called him Mangas Coloradas, red sleeves, for the blood-stained garments that resulted from his raids against their settlements. Historians regard him as probably the most important Native American leader of the 19th century. Mangas became the principal chief of the Mimbreño Apache in 1837, after his predecessor, Juan José Compa, was murdered by trappers collecting the bounty the Mexican government had placed on Apache scalps. The response of Mangas was systematic and overwhelming. He drove the white and Mexican population from the entire Santa Rita del Cobre copper mining region of southwestern New Mexico, slaughtered supply convoys, and began decades of coordinated warfare against Mexico that his son-in-law Cochise would later join and extend against the Americans. What set Mangas apart from every other Apache leader was his ability to unite bands that had traditionally remained independent. Through marriages that tied him to Cochise of the Chiricahua, Victorio of the Warm Springs Apache, and other leaders, he created an informal confederation that could concentrate force when needed and disperse when pursued. He signed a peace treaty with the United States in 1846 when the Americans arrived as enemies of Mexico, which he respected as the conquerors of his old adversary. That peace held for 15 years until gold was discovered near Pinos Altos in the Mogollon Mountains of New Mexico in 1860, and miners began arriving in numbers that made the land uninhabitable for the people who had always lived there. Soldiers, violate a truce and start a war. On January 27, 1861, a raiding party that most historians now identify as Coyotero Apache, not Chiricahua, attacked the ranch of a man named John Ward near Fort Buchanan in what was then the Arizona Territory. They stole cattle and took Ward's 12-year-old stepson, Felix Ward. Ward went to the nearest army fort and identified the kidnappers, incorrectly, as the band of Cochise, the principal chief of the Choconan Chiricahua Apache. The Army dispatched a 24-year-old lieutenant named George Nicholas Bascom, who had graduated near the bottom of his West Point class and had been in Arizona for approximately 3 months. Bascom sent word that he wished to parley. Cochise came. He had maintained friendly relations with Americans for more than a decade, had supplied wood to the Butterfield Overland Mail stagecoach station at Apache Pass, and had no reason to expect treachery. He brought his wife, his son, his brother Coyunwa, and 2 nephews. He came in good faith because he had done nothing. During the meeting, Bascom announced that Cochise and his family were under arrest and would be held as hostages until the Ward boy was returned. Cochise, understanding immediately what was happening, slashed through the canvas tent wall with a knife and escaped alone. His family remained in Bascom's custody. Cochise took American hostages and offered a direct exchange. Bascom refused. Both sides eventually killed their prisoners. Bascom hanged Cochise's brother and nephews. The Apaches killed their American captives. The Chiricahua called what happened at Apache Pass cut through the tent. It is remembered in Apache oral tradition to this day. Cochise said afterward, I was at peace with the whites until they tried to kill me for what other Indians did. I now live and die at war with them. What followed was 11 years of warfare that reduced the southern Arizona Territory to, in the words of one contemporary witness, a landscape of headboards reading "Killed by the Apaches." The Army murders a chief under a white flag. In the summer of 1862, Mangus Coloradas was nearly 70 years old and recovering from a bullet wound in his chest. He had fought the Spanish, the Mexicans, and now the Americans for most of his adult life. He was tired. He sent word through an intermediary that he wished to make a lasting peace, and received assurances from a white scout he trusted that American officers were prepared to negotiate. In January of 1863, he traveled to Pinos Altos in southwestern New Mexico, and then to the nearby Fort McLean under a white flag of truce. What happened at Fort McLean on the night of January 18, 1863, is documented in the testimony of participants and witnesses. Mangas arrived and was immediately taken into custody by armed soldiers who had been waiting for him. He was transferred to the fort, a former post that had been abandoned and burned in 1861 and reactivated for this campaign. Brigadier General Joseph Rodman West gave his sentries a verbal order that has been quoted in multiple accounts. "Men, that old murderer has got away from every soldier command and has left a trail of blood for 500 miles on the old stage line. I want him dead tomorrow morning, do you understand? I want him dead." That night, the sentries heated bayonets in a campfire and burned the feet and legs of the old chief as he tried to sleep. When he moved in response to the pain, they shot him. The official report said he had been killed while trying to escape. The following day, soldiers decapitated the body, boiled the head to extract the skull, and sent it to a phrenologist named Orson Fowler in New York City, who placed it on display. The skull subsequently disappeared. The Apache believed that Mangus Coloradas, without his head, could not enter the afterlife. His murder under a flag of truce and the mutilation of his body produced nearly 25 more years of warfare. One band teaches the cavalry how to disappear. In February of 1861, after the killing of his brother and nephews at Apache Pass, Cochise gathered the Chiricahua Apache and declared war on the United States. What followed was one of the most effective guerrilla campaigns in the history of North American warfare. For 11 years, Cochise and his warriors made large sections of the Arizona Territory functionally uninhabitable for settlers and nearly impossible for the Army to control. Entire stretches of road were abandoned. Ranches stood empty. The Army, in rare moments of candor, admitted it could not find him. The reason was not mystery. It was mastery. Cochise and his warriors knew every water source, every hidden canyon entrance, every escape route through the Dragoon Mountains, the Chiricahua Mountains, and the Dos Cabezas Range that formed the geographic heart of Chiricahua territory. They traveled at speeds that repeatedly left pursuing cavalry exhausted and empty-handed. They attacked, withdrew, and reappeared somewhere else entirely. When American troops came too close, they crossed into Mexico, where American soldiers could not legally follow. When Mexican forces came too close, they crossed back into American territory. The border was a tactical instrument. General George Crook, who would eventually become the most effective American commander in the Apache Wars, described what his men were up against. The Apache can endure fatigue and famine, and can live without water for periods that would kill the hardiest mountaineer. In fighting them, we must necessarily be the pursuers, and unless we can surprise them by sudden and unexpected attack, the advantage is all in their favor. You rarely see an Indian. You see the puff of smoke and hear the whiz of his bullets, but the Indian is thoroughly hidden in his rocks. The peace, when it finally came in 1872, required 11 days of direct negotiation in the Dragoon Mountains by a general named Oliver O. Howard, guided to Cochise' stronghold by his friend Tom Jeffords. Cochise agreed to a reservation on his own ancestral land with Jeffords as agent. 2 years after Cochise died in 1874, the reservation was dissolved and his people were removed. 200 warriors outrun 4,000 soldiers. In 1879, a Warm Springs Apache chief named Victorio faced a choice that had become familiar to every Apache leader of his generation. The United States government intended to move his band from their homeland at Ojo Caliente in the mountains of southern New Mexico. The Warm Springs territory, where his people had lived for generations, to the San Carlos Reservation in the Arizona desert. San Carlos was known among the Apache as Hell's 40 Acres. Summer temperatures there reached 110 degrees. Water was bad. The land supported almost no game. Farming was nearly impossible. The Army had concentrated thousands of Apache from rival bands onto the same land, creating conditions that the government's own agents described in official reports as intolerable. On August 21, 1879, Victorio fled the reservation with approximately 80 warriors and their women and children. Over the following months, his force grew to a maximum of 200 warriors. An unusually large force for an Apache band, assembled from Warm Springs Apache and Mescalero allies. Against them, the United States eventually deployed more than 4,000 soldiers. The 9th and 10th Cavalry, the African-American units known as Buffalo Soldiers, the 6th Cavalry, the 15th Infantry, and Texas Rangers. For 14 months, Victorio fought more than 24 battles and skirmishes across southern New Mexico, western Texas, and northern Mexico, and won most of them. He crossed the Rio Grande repeatedly to evade pursuit, using the border exactly as Cochise had used it a decade earlier. Colonel Benjamin Grierson, who commanded the Buffalo Soldiers in Texas and adopted a defensive strategy of blocking water sources rather than chasing Victorio directly, came closest to containing him. Victorio repeatedly slipped through. What finally stopped him was not the American army. 5,000 men, chase 38 across a desert. On October 14th and 15th, 1880, in the Tres Castillos Mountains of the Mexican state of Chihuahua, the War of Victorio ended. He had sent his lieutenant Nana and a small party out to find ammunition. His band had been running low for weeks. He had sent other men to hunt for food. In that moment of dispersal, the Mexican Colonel Joaquin Terrazas arrived with 260 men and surrounded the camp. Victorio had almost no ammunition with which to fight back. The battle lasted into the night. When it was over, 62 Apache warriors were dead, 16 women and children were dead, and 68 women and children had been taken prisoner. 3 Mexicans were killed. The Apache version of Victorio's death holds that he fell on his own knife rather than face capture. The Mexicans never identified which body was his with certainty. In the years that followed, a Chiricahua Apache named Geronimo inherited the final chapter. Born in June of 1829 in a canyon near what is now the Arizona-New Mexico border, Geronimo, his Apache name was Goyaway, meaning the one who yawns, was never a chief but a war shaman and tactical leader whose spiritual reputation gave him authority his formal position did not. In 1858, Mexican soldiers under Colonel Jose Maria Carrasco attacked an Apache camp near Llanos, Chihuahua, while the men were in town trading. They killed Geronimo's mother, his wife, Alope, and his 3 children. Geronimo wrote in his memoir, "I was never again contented in our quiet home." For the following 28 years, he fought. His final breakout from the San Carlos Reservation began in May of 1885 with approximately 130 followers, men, women, and children, and quickly attracted the attention of 5,000 United States Army soldiers, 1/4 of the entire standing army. 5,000 men. Chase 38. Across a desert. The numbers were almost impossible to believe when the army compiled them afterward. During the final campaign against Geronimo between May of 1885 and September of 1886, the United States deployed more than 5,000 cavalry soldiers. They were supported by 500 Apache scouts, including Chiricahua men from the reservation who were tracking their own relatives, and 3,000 Mexican soldiers operating simultaneously on the southern side of the border. Against this force, Geronimo's band at its maximum numbered approximately 130 people, including women, children, and elderly. By the end, only 38 remained. The group covered up to 80 miles per day across the Sierra Madre of northern Mexico, through terrain that exhausted horses and broke supply lines. In the 12 days between November 23rd and the end of December of 1885, a raiding party of 12 Apache warriors led by a man named Olzana covered 1,200 miles, killed 38 people, captured 250 head of livestock, and suffered a single casualty before disappearing back into Mexico. American military commanders who studied the raid afterward were unable to find a parallel in the records of any professional army. In March of 1886, General George Crook forced Geronimo to the negotiating table at Cañón de los Embudos in Sonora, Mexico. Geronimo agreed to surrender. That night, an American soldier sold his band liquor, and someone told them that they would be executed when they crossed the border. Geronimo and approximately 40 followers fled into the darkness. General Nelson Miles replaced Crook and brought 5,000 additional men into the field. 5 months later, on September 4th, 1886, Geronimo surrendered for the final time at Skeleton Canyon, Arizona, after learning that his entire people, including peaceful Apache from the reservation who had never fought, had already been transported to Florida. The last warrior surrenders and dies in prison. On September 8, 1886, 27 Apache were loaded into train cars in Arizona and transported east to Fort Pickens on Santa Rosa Island, near Pensacola, Florida. Geronimo was among them. It was the first time in his life that he had seen the ocean. His family, who had surrendered separately, was taken to Fort Marion in St. Augustine, 300 miles away. They would not see each other for 8 months. Many Apache died of tuberculosis on the journey or in the coastal forts, their immune systems unprepared for the humid lowland climate, so unlike the high desert mountains where they had lived their entire lives. In 1887, the survivors were transferred to the Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama. Approximately 1/4 of the Apache prisoners died there. In 1894, Geronimo and 341 other Chiricahua Apache were transported to Fort Sill in what was then Indian Territory in Oklahoma, where they remained prisoners of war for the next 19 years. Geronimo farmed. He joined a Dutch Reformed Church congregation, which subsequently expelled him because he could not stop gambling. He dictated his memoirs to a secretary named S.S. Barrett, published in 1906, one of the first autobiographies of a Native American leader in American history. The government that had promised him return to Arizona after exile never honored that promise. He was displayed at the Trans-Mississippi Exposition in Omaha, Nebraska, in 1898. He rode in President Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade in 1905. He personally asked Roosevelt for permission to return to his homeland. Roosevelt refused. The man who had led 38 people across 2 nations against 5,000 soldiers lived his last years signing autographs and selling photographs of himself for pocket money at state fairs. He died at the Fort Sill Military Hospital on February 17, 1909, still listed officially as a prisoner of war. He was approximately 79 years old. His grave is at the Fort Sill Apache Indian Cemetery in Oklahoma. He never saw the Chiricahua Mountains again.